Elias checked his watch, a sharp sigh escaping his lips as the line at the pharmacy crawled forward at an agonizing pace, his patience wearing dangerously thin after a grueling 60-hour work week that had left his nerves entirely frayed and his empathy utterly depleted. Ahead of him, a young mother struggled with a toddler who was screaming at the top of his lungs, her frantic attempts to shush him only seeming to amplify the piercing wails that echoed off the cold, fluorescent-lit walls of the store. "Control your kid," Elias muttered under his breath, glaring at her trembling hands as she fumbled with a crumpled coupon that the exhausted-looking teenage cashier rejected for the third consecutive time. The cashier, a pale boy with dark, heavy circles under his eyes, moved with an infuriating slowness, meticulously scanning each item as if time had simply ceased to exist, entirely oblivious to the growing queue of agitated customers tapping their feet in restless, unified frustration. Elias shifted his judgmental gaze to a man in a rumpled suit standing near the exit, staring blankly at his phone and completely blocking the narrow aisle, completely unaware of the physical space he was monopolizing in this cramped, miserable environment. It took exactly 3 seconds for Elias to categorize them all: the incompetent mother, the lazy teenager, the oblivious businessman, wrapping them up in neat little boxes of disdain without a single second of hesitation or grace. He didn't know, and frankly didn't care to know, the intricacies of their mourning, convinced that his own rush to pick up a simple prescription was the absolute center of the universe right now. From the corner of his eye, he noticed an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that held the quiet wisdom of decades, watching him with a serene but penetrating gaze that made him instinctively straighten his posture and break his scowl for a fraction of a second. Her name was Clara, and she had spent 88 years watching the hurried, angry dance of humanity, understanding with absolute certainty that the surface was never the whole story, that the anger radiating from the man in the trench coat was merely a shield for an exhausted soul. Elias scoffed internally at her gentle smile, returning his hostile attention to the young mother who was now fighting back tears as the total on the register blinked a number she clearly could not afford, the line behind Elias groaning in collective, cruel frustration. He was one breath away from loudly offering to pay just to make her move faster, not out of kindness, but out of a desperate need to escape the chaotic symphony of incompetence that was ruining his perfectly scheduled afternoon. The toddler threw a plastic toy to the floor, the sharp clatter snapping the last thread of Elias's restraint, prompting him to step out of the line with a sharp, judgmental critique on his tongue, ready to unleash his stress onto easy targets who had committed the unforgivable crime of inconveniencing him. He was entirely blind to the invisible, crushing burdens they all carried, wrapped up in a self-centered bubble of efficiency that completely isolated him from the fundamental raw humanity bleeding out right in front of him in aisle 4. Before Elias could vocalize his harsh reprimand, the elderly woman, Clara, stepped forward with a grace that defied her fragile frame, gently placing a weathered, comforting hand on the young mother's trembling shoulder and whispering something so profoundly soothing that the woman immediately broke down into silent, grateful sobs. Clara seamlessly handed the cashier a crisp $20 bill, offering the pale teenager a warm, knowing smile that seemed to momentarily lift the heavy fog of exhaustion from his youthful features, transforming the tense atmosphere of the checkout lane into a quiet sanctuary of unexpected grace. Elias froze, his self-righteous anger suddenly feeling heavy and toxic in his chest as he overheard Clara softly ask the mother about the eviction notice she had received just 2 hours prior. A devastating piece of paper that explained the frantic coupon clipping and the absolute terror radiating from her exhausted eyes. The cashier, emboldened by Clara's kindness, quietly apologized for his sluggishness, confessing to the heir that he had been working the night shift to pay for his mother's chemotherapy treatments and hadn't slept in over 36 hours, his slow movements not born of laziness, but of a desperate, bone-deep physical failure he was fighting with every ounce of his willpower. Over by the door, the man in the rumpled suit finally dropped his phone, his knees buckling slightly as he leaned against the glass, the horrifying reality of the layoff email he had just finished reading finally crashing over him, stripping away his livelihood and his pride in a single, unceremonious digital blow. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his neck, his previous judgments echoing in his mind like cruel, unforgivable insults, realizing with a sickening wave of guilt that he had mentally crucified a newly homeless mother, a devoted, exhausted son, and a freshly unemployed father in the span of 3 agonizingly ignorant seconds. Clara turned her wise, time-softened eyes toward Elias, her gaze completely devoid of malice but heavy with a truth that pierced right through his cynical armor, silently communicating the profound reality that every single person in that room was fighting a silent, terrifying battle that he knew absolutely nothing about. The invisible backpacks of grief, fear, and exhaustion they wore were suddenly glaringly obvious to him, fundamentally shifting the lens through which he viewed the entire world, replacing his frustration with a crushing, humbling wave of profound empathy that left him momentarily breathless and entirely ashamed of his own narrow perspective. He had looked at these shattered, struggling human beings and only seen obstacles in his path, minor inconveniences to his day, rather than fragile lives desperately clinging to the very edge of the abyss, needing nothing more than a momentary break, a kind word, or just the absolute bare minimum of human understanding. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, dismantling decades of ingrained impatience and teaching him in one agonizingly beautiful moment that before judging anyone you must fiercely try to know their reason, because the surface is a liar and the truth of their pain is always hidden just beneath the frantic, chaotic exterior of everyday life. The pharmacy door slid open, letting in a rush of cold city air that felt like a baptism, awakening Elias to a completely new reality where he was no longer a passive, judgmental observer, but an active, compassionate participant in the fragile ecosystem of human struggle that surrounded him on every single street corner. He stepped out into the bustling pavement, the noise of traffic and hurried pedestrians no longer a source of irritation, but a canvas of untold stories, prompting him to slow his previously frantic pace and truly look at the faces rushing past him, searching for the hidden fractures and silent pleas for help that he had spent his entire life deliberately ignoring. When a delivery driver abruptly cut him off at the crosswalk, forcing him to hit the brakes hard, Elias didn't slam his hand on the horn or shout an obscenity as he would have just an hour ago. Instead, he took a deep, steadying breath, imagining the crushing delivery quotas, the threat of termination, and the desperate rush to make rent that was likely driving the man's reckless desperation. Later that afternoon, as he sat in a crowded subway car, he noticed a teenage girl quietly weeping in the corner, her face buried in her oversized scarf, largely ignored by the sea of commuters who treated her pain as a socially awkward inconvenience they desperately needed to avoid looking at. Remembering Clara's quiet courage, Elias stood up, walked over to the empty seat beside the girl, and simply offered her an unopened pack of tissues from his briefcase, not demanding an explanation or intruding on her grief, but simply offering a silent, undeniable acknowledgement that she was seen, that her pain was valid, and that she was not entirely alone in the suffocating darkness of whatever tragedy had broken her heart that morning. The girl looked up, her tear-streaked face registering a brief moment of shock before softening into a profoundly grateful, fragile smile that cracked through her sorrow, taking the tissue with a whispered thank you that echoed louder in Elias's soul than any symphony ever could. He finally understood the core message Clara lived by, that when someone is falling apart in public, acting out in anger, or moving too slowly through life, it is rarely an attack on you, but rather a desperate silent scream because they are drowning under a weight you cannot see. And in those critical, fleeting moments, they do not need your judgment, your annoyance, or your swift condemnation. They needed you to pause, to breathe, to extend a fraction of the grace you would beg for if the universe had dealt you their invisible hand, transforming the cold, disconnected world into a slightly softer place where humanity catches its own before they hit the ground. Elias walked home that evening with a lighter step and a heavier heart, forever changed by the simple, earth-shattering realization that kindness is not a weakness or a naive luxury, but the ultimate, most profound strength we possess, the only true antidote to the epidemic of isolation, and the only bridge that can span the terrifying, beautiful gap between every broken, beating heart.